Hello everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this tutorial I am going to show you how to implement token authentication in the Django Rest Framework. We are going to use the Knox Library to generate tokens, and in our application we will be able to register new users, log in existing users, and log out users in the Django Rest Framework. We are going to create tokens to the users when they log in. We will also create tokens when they register, and we will also be able to delete those tokens when they log out. In this tutorial, we will be using Postman to test our application. So if you don't have it on your machine, you can go ahead and install it. I will assume that you know how to create a basic Django project. I will also assume that you are familiar with concepts like views, URLs, and serializers in Django and in the Django Rest Framework. So without wasting any time, let's get into it. Here I am in VS Code and I have created this project, and I assume you know how to create a project in Django. You should be familiar with that. And the first thing I want to do now is to install the dependencies. I am going to install the Django Rest Framework and then the Django Rest Knox. First, I would have to activate my virtual environment. And I'm going to navigate to the main application. Now the first thing I want to do is to go ahead and install the dependencies. I mean the packages we are going to need in this project, which are Django Rest Framework and Django Rest Knox. So I'm gonna go ahead and install them in the terminal. I have these installed already, so I don't have to install them again. But for you, you should wait for the installation to end. The second thing I want to do is to create a new app for the users. I want to implement the authentication in a different app, and I'm going to name this one users, and this is where we are going to have all our views and all our endpoints for the authentication. So this generated a new app. I named it users, and what we need to do is to go in the main application and go in settings and include our apps, in installed apps. First we need the Rest Framework, and you also need to include the Knox app, and finally the users app we created. Now let's go ahead and apply migrations in the terminal again. This is going to generate the database for us. Now I do want to start the server so that we can test this in the browser. So I'm gonna go ahead and run the server. We do need to create a super user for us to be able to log into the Django admin panel. So I am gonna go ahead and create one. Going to stop the server again and going to create a super user. It's going to ask for the username, email, and password. I'm going to create the super user. I created the now that we have created a super user. Now we will be able to log in the Django admin panel. So let me start the server again. Now, as you can see, we have this Knox app with the auth tokens. And basically, when we create new tokens, they are going to be accessible from here. As you can see, we don't have any tokens because we haven't created one. Now we can start creating our views. So let's go in the views.py and start creating our endpoints. I'm going to get rid of everything in here because we don't need any of these things. I am going to import a bunch of stuff we are going to use for our views. First, we are importing the API view because we are going to use function-based views, and we are importing the response from the REST framework because we also need to return a response to the request. And finally, we are importing this auth token serializer because this one will help us to verify and validate the username and the password of a user. It's going to check if the user is active or not. The first view is going to be the login API. It's going to accept just the post method. We are taking the request as the argument. Now we are going to use this auth token serializer to to validate the data that is coming from the request. It is going to check if the username and password are correct. So the way we can do this, we can call the isValid method, and we are going to raise the exception if the password and username are not correct. Once we have, if this is successful, we are going to get the user from validated data, and with this user we can create a token. When we create a token, we get two things. The first one is created. This tells us if the token was created successfully, and then we get the token itself. And we only need the token, so we can go ahead and do this. And this will just give us the token, and we need to return this token in the response. In the response, I am going to return the user information and then the token. In the user information, I want to return the user ID, their email, and their username as well. Now we need to create endpoint for this view, and what I want to do is to go here in the users and create URLs. This is where we are going to have our endpoints, and the first thing I want to import is the path from Django URLs, and then we need to define, we also need to import the views, and we need to put our endpoints in the URL patterns variable. This is going to be a list, and here we are going to have our view. This basically allows us to create endpoints in our app. The next step is to come back in the main application and go in the urls.py and include, and I'm going to include them, and I want this to use the API endpoint. And this should make our URLs from the user's app accessible. Let's start the server again. One thing we haven't done yet is to configure the settings and make our REST framework use the Knox for authentication instead of the default authentication system. So I'm gonna go in the settings and scroll all the way down. I am going to set the REST framework to use Knox authentication. So, and this is telling our application to use Knox authentication class instead of the default authentication classes. And now we can go in the Postman and test this endpoint. I mean the login view. We can test the login view. Here I am in Postman and I'm going to create a new workspace. This is going to be a post request. I'm going to test this one without sending any data and see what we are going to get. As you can see, we are getting an error with a status of 400, and it's telling us that we need to send the username and password, and this is happening because of this auth token serializer. This one is raising the exception because we are not sending the right data. Now let's go and try to send the username and the password, and the way we can do that is by coming here on the body section and send the form data, and we can have keys for the fields and then the values. The first thing we need is the username and then the password. Now let's go ahead and use the right credentials. Going to use John Doe, and the password for that was 1234 John. So this worked successfully. As you can see, we have the user information and then the token. In the future, we can use this token for authorization. If I go back here in the admin panel and refresh, I can see that I have one token created. Now that we are able to generate tokens, I want to go ahead and create a way users can retrieve the information about their profile and let me go ahead and create an endpoint for the users. This is going to accept a GET request. User data. I'm gonna get user from the request, and we need to check if the user is authenticated. If the user is authenticated, we can return the response, and here we can return the user information. Basically, we can use the same logic we used in the login view. And if the user is not authenticated, they should see a message telling them that they are not authenticated, and the response is going to return a status of 400, which means that they are not authentic. They don't have access to this endpoint. We need to include this view in the URLs. And let's go back in Postman and test if this will work. Change the endpoint users. Also need to change the method to the get method. As you can see, we are getting the error because we are not sending our token. The way we can send our token is by coming here on headers and setting the authorization key to our token. If we send the request now, we should be able to see the information about the user with this token. And this is working as expected. If I come in the admin panel and delete this token and try to get the user information and try to call the API with the same token, I am not going to receive an error. It's going to tell me that the token is not valid, which makes sense because the token is no longer in the database. Now the last view I want to implement is the register view. This one is also going to use a post method. This will allow us to create new users and give them tokens as well. I want to create a new file for serializer. In here I am going to implement a basic serializer. You should also be familiar with serializers in Django Rest Framework. I'm going to import a bunch of stuff. Here we have a basic serializer, and this one is going to use the user model. As you can see, we are importing this user model at the top. And for the fields, we have the username, password, email, first name, and then the last name. And these are the data the users can send when they are trying to register for a new account. Now that we have these fields, we can set the configuration in this variable. I want to start with the password field. This is going to be a write-only field. And then the email is going to be required because by default is not it is not required. For the validators, we want to make sure that the email is unique. Basically what we are doing here, we are saying that the password should be in write-only field, which means that we cannot read the password with this serializer. And we also want to make sure that the email is unique for our users. And if someone tries to create a new account with an email that already exists, they are going to get this message telling them that the user is already taken. The last method we need to implement is the create method. This is going to be called when we try to save the serializer. And what we want to do is to create a new user when we save this serializer. So let's create a new user. From this validated data, we can get all these fields. We can get the username, the password, email, and the first name. And now we can create a user with this data. We need to return this user. So this should work for the serializer. So let's go in the views and import this serializer. And let's go back to the register API and implement the logic. It's going to get the serializer. Also going to get data from the request. We are also going to validate the serializer. If it's not valid, this is going to return errors as the response. Now I'm going to save this serializer. This will give us the user, and with this user you can create a new token, like the way we created a token with the login API. For the response, we need to return the user information and then the token, so you can go ahead and use the same logic from the login API view. go ahead and copy this. So this view should allow us to create new users. So I'm gonna go ahead and include this one in the URLs as well. Now let's go ahead in Postman and test this. This is going to be a post request. We don't need to send this authorization header. Instead, we need to come here and send the data. Here, if we don't send any data, we should get errors telling us that the username, the password, and the email are required. So let's go ahead in the body section and include these fields of the username. Also need the email, and then the first name, and the last name. Let's try to create a new user. I'm going to use the username of Richard 1234. Richard. .com. Richard Miles. Send the request. It created a new user, and if we go back in the browser and check users, we can see that we created a new user. At this point, we are able to create new users, and we are also able to log in existing users, and we can also get the information about the user using the authorization token. And what I want to do now is to allow users to send requests and be able to log out and delete the tokens from the database. Knox has these functionalities implemented already, so we are not going to create new views from the scratch. Instead, we are going to import them from Knox. We are going to go ahead and import views from Knox. Going to import them as Knox views. Going to have two methods. The first one is going to be for logging out. Knox view, logout. So this is a class-based view, so we need to call this as view method. And finally, the logout all. The logout view is going to delete the token from the database, and it is going to log out the user, and the logout all view is going to delete all tokens associated to one user. So it is going to log out the user from all devices and browsers. These are class-based views, so that's why we are calling the asView method. So what I want to do now is to go ahead and try to log out this user and see if this token is going to be removed from the database. Let's go back in the Postman. This is the token we generated when we created this user, or we can use it for the authorization. Need to change it. The endpoint we need to hit is the logout endpoint. Now we can send the request. This gave us a status of 200, which means that the request was successful. And if we go back here in our tokens, we are going to see that we don't have any tokens because we have logged out. Alright guys, this is the end of this video. I hope you learned something from it. If you have any questions, please comment them down below. I will try to answer them. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one.